This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast, this episode 220, is the Guinness Book of World Records holder for most beer collaboration brews. He is the pastriest of the pastriers, the collabiest of the collaborators, and a brewer who has never found an adjunct that he didn't like to add to beer. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe we can correct that one. Kyle Harrop, Horus Aged Ales, welcome to the podcast, Kyle.
Thank you, James.
And I shouldn't say that there is not a single adjunct that you have not liked. I am just absolutely amazed at your ability to find a sheer number of adjuncts, even when they are the same ingredient added in so many different ways into a beer. I'm excited to talk to you, about how you add ingredients into beers, because you have applied yourself in your brewing to doing this in a very creative way that's not just about creating an Instagram story, but also achieving flavor goals within beers. We're going to talk about that. And I should say Horus Aged Ales, you're based out of Oceanside, California, there in Southern California. Yep. Interesting model for the brewery. And we can talk about that more as we get into it. Beers like Coconut Convergence have scored a whopping 96 with our blind panel. Some really cool, fun stuff to talk about there. We're going to dive into that deep world of pastry, dessert, and flavored beers. Before we do that, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chiller's new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chiller's engineers are committed to green technology design, developing a more energy-efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by BSG exclusive distributors of Rahr Malting Company. Since 1847, Rahr Malt has been a benchmark of quality and consistency for brewers from the 19th century to today's craft beer pioneers. Whether you're creating classic lagers, resin-clouded hazies, or barrel-aged behemoths, where our North Star Pills, malted oats, and more are here to make your brewing dreams a reality. Get in touch today at go.bsgcraft.com/contact-us. All right, Kyle, let's get into it. Let's talk about your brewing history first. You have an interesting one. You were an accountant who started a brewing business on the side to kind of flex that creativity as a side hustle. And you set about it by brewing a whole bunch of beers with a whole bunch of people in a very short amount of time. But give me the nutshell history of your beer history and what got you to where you are today.
I started out as just a huge craft beer nerd. I was the weird guy at 21 drinking craft beer. With all my friends are like, "What are you doing? It's more expensive than this natural light we can buy from the store." So that transitioned into me homebrewing. Got really heavy into it in grad school. So again, I was about 21 years old. I had just finished undergrad and started grad school 2 months later. Just really got after it pretty crazily. And by the time I finished grad school, I had about 8 batches going at any given time. And oddly, I did my master's thesis on a business plan for a craft brewery. I did not pursue it at that time. I got an aerospace job in financial accounting about 2 months after I graduated from grad school.
That's interesting. So much aerospace now on the Southern California brewing scene. I know that was Julian Schrago's thing too. Yeah,
and I actually, not to get too sidetracked, but worked at the same company Rob Croxall did. He's the owner of El Segundo Brewery Company in my hometown. His dad coached me in baseball. My parents taught him swimming. Super small world.
Yeah.
So grad school, got a job at Northrop Grumman. They're one of the major aerospace companies in my hometown. Worked there for nearly a decade and a half. At 2015, kind of a perfect storm of things happened. My wife had given me the Horus branding and everything as a gift for our wedding, and at the time I was like, oh cool, I can make home brews and put this logo and stuff on them. But fast forward a few months later, I had a pretty crazy health scare, and everything ended up being fine. But I kind of woke up one day and was like, life can be pretty short, and I want to try to do this. I just had to find a way to make it work and still work my other aerospace job, because I couldn't support a family by just starting out a brewery at the time. And so yeah, getting into the model of Horus, it was a model that I could do while I was working 50, 60-hour weeks on a computer. And a lot of people don't know this, but I started out as primarily mixed culture barrel-aged beers, and I think that's actually one of the first beers you tried from me, Jamie. I remember texting with you about it
Yeah, I think
several
you're
years
right.
ago. And yeah, basically had an engagement party, pulled one of my stouts from a little bourbon barrel and let friends and family taste it, and they were all blown away by it. So kind of like, well, I should probably make some stout, it sounds like, too. So basically that kicked off a year. I did 55 collaborations in 1 year, and learned how to brew professionally, basically. Went from 5 gallons, up to 210 barrels at one spot. Learned everything from a 1 barrel system all the way up to that behemoth, and just really dove right in. And
how do you just start? I mean, I'm really fascinated. This sounds like, one of those scenarios where the guy starts with a paper clip and then ends up trading it for, a luxury yacht or something, by doing, 1,000 different trades. I mean, you don't, for most people, you don't just start by doing collaboration brews. It's the relationships that you build into. How did that happen for you?
So I was a huge beer nerd, and with that came, relationships with pro brewers already. Patrick Brew, I was at the brewery the day he opened. I knew him back in his home brewing days, and I'm actually going to go brew with him tomorrow and make some wine as well. So
nice.
I met Tommy Arthur, Jean Van Roy, just tons of people over the years. Was part of a lot of the major tastings and put on some tastings in San Diego, like Wood Shop, if you're familiar with that, or anyone out there.
Mm-hmm.
And just built relationships over the years. I knew Julian. Julian worked across the hallway from my dad at Raytheon. He was a cryogenics engineer, and my dad's in fire. So I knew him and Gabe, and we used to frequent Seal Beach, and it was just crazy. Once, I told people I was thinking about it, the consensus was go for it. And everyone was super friendly and just, what's the word I'm looking for? They just offered all kinds of information and beyond helpful. And when it came time to learn and do stuff on a professional level, everyone was just there with open arms, and it's crazy. That's what I love about this industry. People ask, "Oh, it's so competitive." Like where you are in San Diego, there's 100 and something breweries. But we all do different things and different sizes, and working together, I think, is my favorite part of the industry. Hence the probably 400 collabs on that at the moment. So
That's it's sheerly insane, but yeah, that that speaks to that kind of interconnectedness, and you're right, both the willingness to learn and to share, and that multi-directional kind of approach that we all take here. No, it's a super cool thing. So you start by making collab beers, but then you're also, trying to, launch your own brand and release your own beer. What was the strategy around that?
So basically filled barrels before I started the collabs, and, mixed culture beers. I don't even taste them until the 12-month mark. So I basically had a year of patience. And
you're brewing, you don't have a brew house. You're brewing wort at other spots, bringing in and fermenting it then yourself.
Exactly. I've used 6 to 8 different breweries in San Diego County to date. I might start using another one or two, but that goes to the relationship thing as well. It's a crazy investment for stainless and all that, especially when I, working a career on the side and won't ever be a full production model. So,
and when you're making that style of beer that's got to sit there for a year plus, sometimes 2 or 3 before you sell it, really nice to not be paying off a brew house at that point.
Exactly. And I just don't, I've bunched numbers, and even on a 10 or 15 barrel system with the amount of beer I could make, I basically would have time for, it would never make sense with the current model. So, I brewed with Wakefield and Great Notion and Pizza Port and a bunch of powerhouse breweries that first year. So when it came time to brew the first stouts of my own, it was there was a lot more comfort than there was the year prior. That's for sure.
Sure. Yeah. Now, at the same time, like everyone had been, jumping into barrel aging, and especially in that 2015, 2016 realm. I mean, folks were getting incredibly good at it. Trying to stand out in that market became harder and harder, and it's now harder than it's ever been, even right now.
Yeah.
Definitely want to talk about how you were able to kind of create an idea around Horus beers, and then, kind of a through line, especially through those, stouts and barrel aged clean beers. Before we do that, is your brewery struggling to source or afford berry ingredients? Historic heat waves devastated U.S. berry crops, causing supply to dwindle and prices to skyrocket. That's why brewers are switching over to Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends, which mimic straight concentrates, but at a better price point and with more reliable supply. Is it any surprise that Old Orchard's best sellers are raspberry and blackberry flavors? Reclaim your margins and order your craft concentrates at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Brew Monitor from Precision Fermentation is the first real-time comprehensive fermentation monitoring solution. It works with your existing fermentation tanks to track dissolved oxygen, pH, gravity, pressure, temperature, and conductivity in real time from any smartphone, tablet, or PC. Brew Monitor provides detailed insight into your fermentation that helps improve beer consistency, reduce tank time, and increase overall efficiency, saving your brewery time and money. Get started for 30 days risk-free. Visit precisionfermentation.com/brewing. So Kyle, as you started brewing stouts, I love it that you are downplaying and getting into this humbly, learning from other folks as you do it. But from the time you started releasing them, there was demand for them. People wanted them, and you definitely had a flavor forward approach to those. So talk to me about how you set out to differentiate yourself in the market from the outset.
Well, I mean, it was a happy accident at the beginning in that I brewed the stout the way I like to at home, and that was, very focused on my sweet tooth. Even the beers that I wasn't adjuncting at home, they would finish a lot higher than homebrew recipe or something you would find online. And the idea behind that was sitting in barrels, they're going to thin out and absorb some of that booze. So to keep them on the sweeter side, keeping the gravity up. And I just went for it from the beginning on that front. And to answer your question, how I differentiated myself from the beginning, it was and still is just pushing boundaries, I think. You mentioned it earlier with using any and all kinds of adjuncts. I think as much has been done in craft beer and brewing, there's still a lot of room for experimentation, and I think that's what keeps me excited about it and keeps me pushing. And it really shapes how I approach brewing. So stout-wise, basically to narrow it down to 5 different recipes. And let's say I'm going for a fresh stout that is not going to see barrels and it's going to have coffee in it. I will generally leave all roasted malt out of that beer and let the coffee do the balancing.
Okay.
And if I'm going for so you mentioned coconut convergence earlier. That beer I would keep roasted barley and carafa too and malts like that in there, because you're going to add so much sugar and sweetness from that adjunct that you don't want to overdo it. That beer that would have the coffee in it, if you added coconut to that, it would essentially taste like a snow cone or cake. I mean, it's going to be over the top sweet and sugary. So I approach each stout as, is it going into a barrel or not? And then what adjunct is it getting, if any? And I tailor the malt bill towards that.
That's interesting. Even with the barrel-aged beers that are going to sit for a while, you still, as you brew them, you're thinking down the road into, what adjunct is probably going to go into that and adjusting that. Or I guess at this point you could even think about having drier, sweeter, roastier, more bitter, stuff that can go into any school of adjunct. I mean, just to have a little bit more flexibility. How does that work for you?
Yeah. So when I'm brewing a stout for barrels, I'll typically have it finish significantly higher than a fresh stout. So it'd be pretty grossly sweet if you were to just bottle it after it's 5-6 weeks in the tank. But over time in the barrel, and it pulls in all the tannins and everything else, it keeps it from going too lean, too thin, too boozy. And I don't really approach it the same way I did at the beginning. So now I have quite a barrel stock compared to what I did from the get-go. I go into everything as it being non-adjuncted at this point, especially working with William LaRue Weller, all the Pappies, Thomas Handy, Birthday Bourbon, like all these crazy barrels I've gotten in the past few years. I don't want to necessarily add anything to those because they're such crazy expressions of, the original alcohol on their own. But, some do jump out at me. If I taste something that I think is going to pair well with an adjunct, I'll do a bunch of bench tests. I think the most recent one that was released so far was a good example of it was a beer called Planifolia Per. And people thought I was nuts putting vanilla into a 3-year-old Pappy, I think it was a 20-year bourbon barrel-aged stout. But there was just something that was speaking to me. I had just gotten these Congo vanilla beans, and throughout the bench testing, the beer tasted a lot better with vanilla than it did without it. And that's ultimately how I make that decision now.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that just because the bourbon that comes out of that barrel is fantastic doesn't always mean that the barrel itself is going to be some magical thing for the beer that you put into it, especially a barrel especially a barrel that's that old. And of course, I think, as everybody knows that makes these things, a lot of times the condition that the barrel arrives to you in matters even more than what spirit was in it. But at the same time, sounds really, really, really cool to have a beer aged in 20-year-old Pappy Van Winkle barrels.
Yeah, it's awesome. With that said, I think if I had a choice of any barrel to use, I think just 7 or 8 year Weller or Blanton's barrels, or even Hill in that same age statement is kind of the cream of the crop from my experience. It's crazy so I started this series this past year called the Collaborators series, and I'm bottling the 3rd and 4th one here shortly. But it's basically an expression from a VTAC barrel or a Pappy barrel. And the first 4 have been one non-adjunct and one vanilla version from those same barrels. So the first one was George T. Stagg, and out of any barrel I've ever used, that was the craziest roller coaster of flavor changes. That the whiskey in that oak was so intensely hot. I think that batch I got was 142 proof or somewhere in the 140. So you're dealing
serious
with
hazmat right there. Yeah.
With rocket fuel. So, it was scary how much bourbon character it took on in the first time I had tasted it. And then it was a slow progression of mellowing out, and it just ended up being like the fudgiest, most chocolate forward, not adjunct beer I've ever done. And, I don't know if I'll get a chance to use Stagg barrels again, but that's just another like super fun experiment that I was fortunate enough to get to do. So
interesting. Yeah. I guess you won't have any 2021 Stagg, George T. Stagg barrels. So, hey, there you go.
Yeah.
I want to step back a second and talk about this, because I think it's really interesting as you're formulating these, these ideas in your head, making these kinds of adjustments. Initially now you've settled into that. What do those kind of 5 core recipes generally look like for you now?
You talking like grain bills?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the sweeter one that I would add coffee to, that first example, would be a lot of crystal malt. It's essentially a dark English barley wine with some pale chocolate and midnight wheat for color. So oddly enough, I'm about to release, I guess you can say I'm going to create a new beer style. I don't know if it'll catch on or anything, but I'm going to call it Cryst-Ale, and it's 100% crystal malt beer, which was just awful fresh, like the sweetest, most astringent, just weird thing out of the tank. But I knew going into it, I was putting that thing into barrels for a minimum of 18 months for all those flavors to do their thing. And, I was apprehensive about it. And then earlier this year, I visited Brad at Private Press for the first time and tasted his Munich wine, and that like made me confident and not scared to release, a completely new beer style. And you say 100% crystal malt, to a lot of brewers are going to look at you like you're nuts, but, a lot of rice holes later and a lot of time in oak, and I'm fascinated with the outcome of that one. It is somewhere in between an English barley wine and I would say a really chocolate forward stout with some dark fruit notes. Pretty cool. So
when you say all crystal malt, how do you, in general, kind of spread that out through that crystal spectrum then?
So the majority was like Crystal 15L, the lightest they make. My favorite malt in the world is DRC, double roasted crystal from Simpson's. There's a good amount of that in there, a tiny bit of extra dark, and then just sprinklings of the lighter ones. and highest original gravity I could get, and it finished, I think it's 14 Plato. So it's thinner than a lot of
right. So not as sweet as you typically might go into a barrel then.
Yeah, not as sweet and not as thick as a lot of my stouts coming out of the barrel, but not really its intention. I can tweak things as time goes on. We'll see how it's received amongst consumers, but I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, from a sensory perspective, as you tasted it going in, what did it taste like? And now that you taste it, how would you describe how the barrel changed that experience over time?
Yeah, at first it was somewhere in between like melted down Werther's Originals and this very weird like minerality I couldn't put my hand on. And now it's transitioned into a very like toffee and caramel forward with like milk chocolate notes. I don't get a lot of vanilla and oak like I typically do from barley wine, like an English barley wine or a lot of my stouts even. The wood almost just pronounce what you're trying to do with the crystal malt. It's like just a gigantic caramel bomb.
Interesting. Talk to me a little bit about hops and then of course yeast in that. Do you use? I mean, you're in San Diego, so I assume you're using a relatively dry workhorse West Coast yeast. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then how do you what's your approach to hops look like in something like that?
Yeah, hops. I'm typically in the 30 to 40 IBU range on the stouts and barley wines. I tend to gravitate towards Columbus and Warrior. I couldn't tell you why. That's what I did. Home brewing, and I've just stuck with it. I've always liked that flavor profile that goes along with it. With, the yeast, it's going to depend on what I want that final beer to be. If I want to make, a 40 Plato original gravity stout and get it down in the low teens, then I'm going to have to use San Diego super yeast, which I had used for many, many years. It's a white lab strain. I think it was like 99 or one of the 90 strains. I've tried combinations of USO5 and champagne yeast on those bigger beers, but I like San Diego super more.
Yeah.
And I typically use Chico or American Ale if we're not going for some massive ABV right off the bat. And I think my sweet spot is, finishing in the 10 to 12% ABV range before barrels and having it take on a percentage point or even 3 or 4 like that stag one did. I think that's where I've kind of decided where I want to be. It took me about 5 years to get to there, but that's where I'm happy right now.
When you say it took you 5 years to get to there, what do you mean? You were trying higher, you were trying lower, and there's just something about the way that those varying flavors, sweetness, roast, coffee, ingredients, extraction, everything else works right at that kind of ABV range that fits what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of like my earlier barrel-aged stouts were 16, 17%. And at that point, you have to use so much adjunct to kind of get past the booze of the barrel character that it's not doing either side justice. And I think finding that sweetness, that hint of sweetness still is at least like what my club members and people that enjoy my beers are expecting and looking for. So, I dialed back the ABV for those reasons. That's not to say I don't have some really strong stuff in barrels still, and I will release those in the future. But I got to the point with, I think Coconut Convergence was one of them where it was like 16%, and you're just adding coconut and adding coconut and more coconut and more coconut and more coconut to get that like pastry profile that I know people are going to be wanting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, the intensity is great, but you can achieve that intensity at the lower ABV using a more reasonable amount of those things that is just friendlier to everybody and also, what makes a more drinkable beer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about how you select and add some of these adjunct ingredients, and also talk about how I'm really interested in this because, again, you really play the spectrum of different ways to add these ingredients. And before we do that, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brewhouse to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brewhouses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented working with world-renowned industry veterans and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head over to ssbrewtech.com. Also, have you heard of PBW tablets? Yeah, that's right. The PBW powder you've known and trusted is now in tablet form from 5 Star Chemicals. Available in 2 sizes, so you can use just 1 tablet in either 32 ounces or 1 gallon of water to optimize your cleaning. Forget measuring. Just add a tablet to water and quickly clean all stainless equipment, growlers, kettles, or carboys. Purchase on their website or at your favorite homebrew supplier. So, Kyle, you definitely have a reputation for, I'm not going to call it overkill, because as I've tasted your beers, I think that even though they're sweet, even though you use a lot of different ingredients in them, there's a point to it. And there's a balance to it. We talk about sweetness, especially in the case of stouts, and there's that certain kind of brewer that loves to complain about how beers are sweet and this is how beer should be and blah, 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 blah. And I understand. I get that point of view. I can appreciate that. But also, as I taste well-made beers in this kind of dessert and pastry realm, the thing that separates well-made ones from simply cloying over the top, a fan service, is that kind of balance. A beer can be that sweet. It can be that intensely sweet if it's well balanced in that kind of sweetness. And so, I think that, as I taste your beers, they don't feel unbalanced in that kind of absurd sweetness. There is, you are certainly considering all of these pieces as they go into it in order to create a rounded whole, that works. Having said that, you go at it pretty hard. Let's talk about some of the more interesting ingredients from your perspective that you've tapped into and what you've found in exploring some of these different ways to use these different forms, varieties, origins, and whatnot of ingredients. Kick me off with one in particular that you think is interesting, and leave some space to talk about.
Yeah, I think for what I'm known for is probably coffee the most, and ironically, I don't drink coffee. I've always found it to be the best in keeping things in balance in darker beers, and I got really intrigued when a buddy of mine started a roasting company. He has a subscription service, and smelling and tasting Jamaica Blue Mountain and Geisha and all these things for the first time, and it just opened my mind to what that could transform a stout into. So, at home, I tried every method possible. There might be one I haven't tried, but I haven't thought of it yet. We're talking cold brew, fine ground, dusting it into sand, all across the board. And what I've come to think works best for me is 24 hours whole bean, steep it in a tank like a, it's funny when people ask me about my adjuncting, I describe it as a tea bag a lot of the time, because basically putting the flavor steep in the beer. I do recirculate and do those things too, but coffee especially, I think the gentle extraction you get from a whole bean that's not overly roasted and not under roasted just adds a crazy expression to your beer. And, I've met a lot of people over the years that do things completely different on the coffee spectrum. I'm typically about a pound per barrel. I talked to Corey King and Phil, so Corey at Side Project and Phil at Perennial, and I think one of them does 7 pounds per barrel and the other does 10 on theirs. And I'm just like, wow, that's so much. But, their beers are great. And Stump and Coffee Shop Vibes right off the bat come to mind as some of my favorite coffee beers. And
sure.
Their method is completely different than mine, but it works too. So I don't think there's, perfect way of doing things, but my way has been pretty much just one day in the bright tank before packaging.
1 day whole bean in the bright tank. What kind of temperature?
In the high 30s typically.
Yeah.
A lot of people, that goes back to the other methods. I know some people that swear by doing it early on in the 60s. And when I've tried that in the past, I get that peppery, I call it nacho kind of bite that I can't handle. Once I smell that, I can't even drink it. So I try to stay away from that. And then, not pulling out too much acidity. Coffee can get crazy tart if you're not careful. And I found that with doing like cold brew extraction at home a lot of the time. So I think my paranoia kind of shaped how I do it now. And there's other brewers that do things a lot different that have great success, but that's been what works for me.
When it comes to selecting and roasting coffee, what does that look like for you? I mean, how do you mentioned Jamaican Blue or Blue Mountain coffee and Gesha coffee, but, is there some method to what you're looking for in those flavors as you select that? And then again, how it's roasted in order to kind of bring the flavor out?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much every year I'd buy an auction lot of Geisha, and that can vary from a couple $100, up to over $1,000 a pound. So
Jeez.
What I'm looking for in that coffee is so delicate. And, if you, again, don't roast it enough, it can get quite acidic. If you over roast it, it kind of ruins all of its characteristics. So finding one that's chocolate and vanilla forward. Geisha's got this like jasmine-y floral thing going on that I really like in stouts, especially pairing that with vanilla or nuts. And I look for those bold flavors. I try to shy away from, like the citrusy ones or the lighter berry notes. Coffee's crazy. I mean, you can sit down and cup 10 different coffees from the same region, and they're entirely different. I don't know if it's my palate or not, but I can't find anything else where that's the case. Like if someone put 10 of the same wines in front of me, or same varieties of wine from the same region, they would probably all taste the same, but the coffees are all across the board for me. So roasting, typically medium. Fortunate to have one of my best friends do the roasting, and he also does the graphic design on my labels. So it's pretty awesome.
Multi-talented.
And yeah, very talented guy. And I don't try to overthink it. I don't say I'm only buying from this farm or this roaster or this. I keep an open mind, and it changes annually. I mean, the flavor differences are pretty crazy. Thinking back to a beer I did called Proper Dose, like the Geisha in that, to the Geisha I just used in a beer that's coming out in a few weeks here, they could not be more different. The Proper Dose one already had like this nuttiness and chocolate to it, and this new batch is, I've had multiple people try it, and they're like, how much vanilla did you put in this? And I'm like, the only adjunct is coffee, and it's pretty cool. So you get that expression.
It has to be an expensive thing to use coffee that's that expensive as a whole bean with that kind of limited extraction. But I can see why, if you can get the kind of flavor out of it that you want at 1 pound per barrel, that is, it's much more reasonable than the way that some folks are using it. I'm just so fascinated that you can get that level of extraction with that kind of limited time.
Yeah, and that's, it goes back to the stouts grain bill. You kind of keep that as a sweet canvas and let the coffee do its thing. You don't have those roasted malts that counter with it, and that's how I approach stouts. They're basic. If I'm going to adjunct a stout, what is going to be the best canvas for the adjuncts that I'm adding to it? And I always joke with people I collaborate with, especially when we're using new adjuncts, and I say, okay, you guys can be the guinea pigs, and we'll see if this works before I do one on my own.
Warning to future collaborators.
All fun aside, I think collabs in that first year were learning first and foremost, and now it's cool to be in a position, 6-7 years later, where I think my main focus is giving back and teaching other brewers things that have worked for me, because I had so many people do that for me when I was starting out, and I think that's super cool, and just sharing what works and what doesn't. And I think that's the most important thing for any new brewer, especially.
Well, I'm glad that's your point of view, because that's what we're doing right here on this very podcast. But I like this idea that as you pull bitterness out of and roastiness out of the malt bill, then you can add it back in with that coffee, where the flavor and the roastiness are coming back in equal measures, so that you don't also have that kind of overpowering roast existing already in there in the malt bill that you need to then overcome, with the coffee in some way or another. So, I conceptually, I think it follows and makes some sense there. Moving out from coffee, let's talk about another, interesting adjunct kind of ingredient family. Let's talk about vanilla, for example, something that a lot of brewers are finding lots of places, for in their varying beers. Everything from highlighting fruit flavors in wild and sour beers, or even kettle sours, into, of course, adding that kind of warmth, sweetness, and earthiness into barrel-aged stouts and whatnot. Over the last couple of years in particular, especially after the kind of vanilla crunch that we experienced, we're now seeing more origins of vanilla. We're seeing maybe a bit of a more broad approach to vanilla flavor and more options out there, more in the palate to work with. Talk to me about how, again, you work through some of these varying origin vanillas and think about the varying flavors that they can add into your beer, and then how you go about getting those into the beer.
Yeah, there's I would say in the past year, probably doubled the spectrum of what there is to choose from.
Right.
And I think vanilla, for me, what I like it to do in my stouts is, I think the perfumey, fragrant note is most important for me. There's a certain kind of sweetness that you get from vanilla, and I think that could add a whole new texture to the beer on that finish. So I think those things are most important. With that being said, used some vanilla lately that's, probably most similar to like tobacco and leather, where like bourbon Madagascar, for example, that's going to be the sweeter, almost like what you would expect from a bakery kind of vanilla.
Right.
And I think that goes great in pastry stouts. I've had a lot of luck with Congo lately. They're just very like rich berry, dark fruit forward. Not as fragrant, but they come through a lot more in the flavor from what I've noticed.
Yeah.
I think Campano is how you say them, but there's these new beans. I saw one of them, I'm not kidding, it was bigger than the banana my son was eating. One bean, it had to be close to a quarter pound. There was only 5 beans in this 1 pound bag. Might have even been bigger. But those, if you cut them open, it just oozes like this crazy molassesy. I don't even know how to describe it. There's almost like a caramel, chocolatey character to them. Never seen anything or smelt or taste anything like those. So I'm really excited to use those. Like at the beginning, I kind of narrowed it down to 3 I typically use, and that was bourbon, Madagascar, Tahitian, and Ugandan. And a lot of that is because that's what was available.
Sure.
I already touched on the bourbon Madagascar. I think that Tahitian is just very fruity compared to the other 2 varieties. And the Ugandan, you get that like really intense, fragrant, almost dry vanilla. And I would like using that in like a very sweet stout. I think it added a really cool layer to that. I had a few beers, I believe from 8 State down in South Carolina, that really opened my eyes to those beans years ago. But like right now, if I had the option, I would probably put Congo in all my stouts. I think it's really complementing them well. It pulls in this like marshmallowy, dark fruit character that I've never gotten before from any vanilla. So.
Huh. And your stouts are already sweet enough that they don't need the, that vanilla to highlight that piece of it even more. But adding that extra earthy, berry element is the piece that makes it.
Yeah, I think that's like probably the perception of vanilla that frustrates me most is people think, sweetness should come from that, but that's a very expensive way to add sweetness. You can add sweetness through grain and boil times and various other ways. Vanilla is not that sweet of a adjunct when you really think of it. It can be, and some of those gross extracts they make and those things are,
right.
But I think layering.
I think it's the psychological thing with vanilla. It's not that it itself is sweet; it's that we just mentally associate it with sweet because every context that we taste it in, whether it's a latte or whether it's a baked good or whatnot, every context that we have it in is sweet. So, I think we mentally fill in the space and just associate it with that. So even if it's sweet itself, it reminds us, like, it pulls that idea of sweetness with it.
For sure. And I think like hearing, consumers and friends of mine that aren't that into beer and hearing like comparisons between lactose and vanilla, where one ingredient is very inexpensive and the other is quite expensive, that's pretty frustrating because I don't know if it's an education thing or what, but I personally haven't used lactose in many beers. I think 2 beers in the last 6 years. And I think vanilla, when you use the real stuff, go about it methodically, you can really make a beer have crazy dimension to it, where the other is just like this perceived sweetness, right off the bat. And
right.
I can go on and on about kettle sours versus barrel-aged sours and all that. I just think that's the way that younger consumer base was viewing some of these things. And one of the most misunderstood adjuncts. How's that?
For sure. Let's talk about coconut for a little while because, again, I mentioned coconut conversions at the top, and we've talked about it a little bit here. That was a crazy wild ride all across all sorts of different ways, from coconut candy and desiccated coconut to, more traditional methods of adding coconut. Part of me thinks that you listed all of those things just to tell a good story, but I'm curious from your perspective. Obviously the beer was fantastic. Talk to me about the kind of elements that some of these different means of coconut preparation can add to a beer.
Yeah, so like toasted coconut, first and foremost, is my favorite to use. I buy it on nuts.com. I've tried various other suppliers, but I really like that one.
Yeah.
That gives this like savory on an island eating like a delicious pastry quality to stouts. I love using that. I steep that, or I'll throw it in a blending tank for upwards of a week. You know, I start tasting it like the 4-day mark and kind of go from there. Desiccated coconut, which is also in Convergence, is basically just dusted. It's very fine. It's it's almost granulated. That's an easy one to use. How's that?
It just works in almost like a powder that you drop into the liquid and mix in.
Exactly. So coconut water was the one that threw me for a loop. I had tried a Bourbon County Stout with it a few years back, and I just tried so many things at home, and the flavor was either non-existent or just over the top, like not pleasant. And what I ultimately ended up doing was putting a whole lot of it into the whirlpool, and I had success doing that. With that said, that was the one and only time I've used it and done it. So who knows?
Right. Hard to pick that piece of coconut out of the whole.
Yeah, and I think it did add a cool kind of savory note to that beer, which was needed, because coconut beers, my problem with them is they can get just flat out cloying.
Yeah.
And with that beer, I think my main goal is always balance, and that beer was very difficult to get what I was looking for. But in the end, I was quite happy. I think the fresh version of that beer, Coconut Crown, was one of people's favorites for me. And I think it's pretty difficult to make a fresh stout taste good with adjuncts. I think barrels are adjuncts in themselves, and they add the most flavor, or essentially the easiest and cheapest adjunct in the end. And I find that fascinating when a consumer will say, "Oh, it's not barrel aged. Why is it this much?" Because I put an actual ton of coconut, or 1,000-pound coffee in there, or $1,000 per pound coffee, and
right.
Like getting a fresh, high alcohol beer to taste good with adjuncts, I would say, has been the biggest challenge for me. And I don't taste many good ones out there. I think what you were saying earlier, like the cloying and the just overly sweet kind of approach, that's what I try to stay away from. And not to toot my own horn, but I do think that those beers are quite hard to make, and they're obviously very expensive to make.
Sure. So you might as well put them into barrels where nobody's going to get mad at you about that or about the price. And it doesn't add that much more to the overall cost of production. But hey, you can happily charge 25% more. Commercial concerns aside, there is something that is nice about the way that flavors can come together over time, and that you're right, from the alcohol and the kind of tannic and oak and vanilla and coconut character the barrels can provide. They just, it helps bring everything together, helps pull it all in, which is
definitely. And I think some beers, Proper Dose, for example, of mine, I don't think the barrel makes those adjuncted versions any better. I think the base beer in the barrel was probably great, but you make a beer and people want a barrel-aged version of it, just because it's sat in the barrel is not going to make it better necessarily. When you're adding 4 different adjuncts to it, it might play off the weird boozy character, or it kind of clashes even at times. So I think vanilla and coconut and coffee really do shine with barrels. I think some of these other adjuncts, it might be detrimental to the beer in the end.
Sure. So when you make a clean version of, say, your coconut beer versus the barrel-aged version, I imagine you're having to stage your additions and timing in different kinds of ways, given those, two flows. Obviously, if you're going to throw some coconut water in the whirlpool, that's going to happen the same time for both of those beers. But I imagine you're not conditioning on coconut before it goes into a barrel. Instead, you're doing it the other way around, where it then goes through the barrel and then goes through that process. How do you make some of those decisions about when to hit each of these, even if they are similarly, conceived beers, both on the non-barrel aged and barrel aged side?
Yeah. So if I know I want to do a barrel aged version of an adjunct beer, I will brew basically two different batches, and the one going into barrels will be higher gravity.
Yep.
With that said, the approach is basically taking that stout from the barrel, putting it into a blending tank or a bright tank, and then treating it with adjunct after the barrel.
Right.
The only adjunct I would put in a barrel is vanilla. I probably do that about a quarter of the time. I tried coffee once at home. It was terrible. Got super oxidized and just awful.
Yeah.
Coconut. I would not want coconut or any, call it a food product in quotes, sitting on beer for over probably 7 to 10 days. So that doesn't make sense. A lot of the nut beers, there'll be nuts in the mash. So that's already got some nut character going into the barrel, but I definitely add them on the back end once the beer is out of the oak.
Sure. Nuts are a tough ingredient given the fat content and of course, and also some of the difficulty in getting enough flavor to really sell the idea of that nut. Are there some that you like more than others, and ways that you like to add those in to, again, not, kill your head retention and, destroy the kind of structural integrity of the beer, but also kind of capture some of that nut goodness?
Yeah, I love hazelnuts. I think they impart the most flavor.
Yeah.
Out of all the, I would say almonds are probably second. I just used cashews for the first time, and that was very difficult. And it required
just because they're so oily.
I would say more so because the flavor is so light. And creating, I'm all about like texture in those nutty beers, and it was just missing that savoriness. So I ended up adding 10% salted cashews, which I've only done that with pecans in the past, and it added just that much more nuttiness. I finally was, content with pulling that beer out of the tank. But I did that, and then I did a version with blueberries as well, cashew and blueberries, and I feel like the blueberries actually brought the nuttiness out in a way. So if I were to make a beer with cashews again, I would probably make a very sweet base beer, even sweeter than I did, because I had to use so many to get that flavor. It added quite a bit of savoriness in the end with the salt.
Sure. No, right. Nuts, it's, we don't, especially when you start adding sweetness into that equation there, it can be hard to find that right kind of balance and make the beer really, capture that. A lot of times nuts get lost in that. Is there an amount that you tend to find works, or is there are there any tricks to, as you add them in, how you add them and improve the extraction as they go?
It definitely depends on what kind of nut. Hazelnuts, I'm typically at about a pound per gallon, which is a lot.
Yeah.
But again, I make a very small amount of beer, very small batches. So it's a lot easier for me to do things like that. I laughed when thinking about doing that on a scale with like pizza port on the collab or something, what that would even look like from a sheer volume standpoint. But
right.
as far as extraction, I treat nuts the same way as coconut. So leave them on there to start tasting it at about 4 days, and kind of go from there. I've never left them on any longer than 9 days. But I like to roast them. I like to chop them, get them pretty fine so there's more surface area. I think your extraction is a lot better that way. You're not going to get much out of a raw hazelnut or a raw almond. You want to bring that flavor out with the heat before adding them to your cold beer. I put them in pretty cold, typically in the mid 40s, or in high 30s, almost right tank temperature. I've found myself pushing more on the quantity and time since I got a pasteurizer, because I'm not as worried about infected bottles as much.
Right.
With that. So, like putting honey or maple syrup and that kind of stuff with a pasteurizer just gives you much more peace of mind in the end. So
what kind of pasteurizer are you using for these?
So I got a batch pasteurizer. I got in touch with Brad Clark at Private Press when I'm going to see him in a couple of days too, actually. But he ordered this one actually near my in-laws in Wisconsin, and you can fit about 60 bottles on a tray, and about 10 to 15 minutes. So he does the same, but finished bottles, caps and everything. Basically get hit with steamy hot water, and once they hit a certain PU, that's what kills things off for a specific period of time, and you pull them out and let them cool. It's been interesting to see like the initial flavor changes in like the first few days, but after that, the beer really doesn't taste any different. Sometimes even better, in my opinion. Yeah. So, had I been a larger brewer and been doing more volume than a couple hundred bottles at a time, I probably would have invested in a tunnel pasteurizer, which I saw like Cycle has. You can just do so much more and so much faster.
Yeah, Doug and I talked about that quite a bit when I talked to him for an episode of the podcast. Doug from Cycle Brewing. The good nature pasteurizers have been gaining a foothold in this kind of pre-bottling or packaging pasteurization also. I know that Brett from Urban Artifact was talking about pasteurizing their own fruit, that cooking element, like you say, can actually sometimes really improve the flavors of these things.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a detriment. It's interesting.
Yeah, I was skeptical at first, especially with things like coffee, but I'm very happy, and I had everything tested at White Labs before, and I still do it now. So it's just an extra layer of having that peace of mind before you release it. And I think going back to like the honey and that kind of stuff, you can't really add that into beers, or you even said fruit, so you can't typically add that kind of stuff without having it in the back of your mind, like, am I creating a grenade here?
Sure.
Is there going to be fermentation in the bottle, or fermentation?
And the flip side is for you, even that, yes, you brew a small amount of beer, but a recall or having to take bottles back or credit people or have something that doesn't work out like that, where, that's hugely impactful because you brew a small amount of beer. And so it's much better to not make that mistake from the outset than have to make good on a mistake like that.
Absolutely. I had one mistake over two different beers, and I instantly bought that pasteurizer because another one would have put me under. I mean,
Yeah.
it's when you're a small brewer, and the costs add up quick. So
Sure.
by the time you talk grain, glass, labels, and all that, I was like, oh boy, this can never happen again. So
Right.
yeah, it's an added piece of labor, and not the most fun process, but it's been a successful one so far.
Let's talk about the craziest adjunct ingredient. As you go back into your library of beers and ingredients, what was the weirdest or most difficult or challenging ingredient that you decided to add to a beer?
Are you talking a collab or something of my own?
You tell me. I'm curious about a story that we can all learn from or avoid if we need to.
I would say on a collab with the brewery in Placentia, we used dulce de leche, and it took months to find one without preservatives. It was basically the only natural one we could find. And it was a nightmare, across the board. These little jars came. It was, I think, 8 ounces a piece. And me and Andrew at the time, he's one of the owners and brewers at Radiant now.
Yep.
But he and I went to a restaurant supply store and bought spatulas, and were, individually pulling the stuff out into the bubbling boil on their pilot system and just watching it like crystallize instantly almost. And that beer was quite successful. And then they decided to do a full blown batch. And to make a long story short, I think everyone that worked on the brewing side of the brewery probably hates me. For that reason alone. That stuff was crazy. I had no idea what impact it would have when put in the boil, but we didn't want to put it on the back end because it's just so much sugar,
right,
that who knows what could happen. So we chose to do it all in the boil, and it gave off this like milky kind of Rolo character to the beer. It's not over the top, but you can definitely tell it's there, and definitely not cheap to get authentic Argentinian, no preservative dulce de leche. So
yeah.
Thanks to Patrick, who was there at the time and gave that green light. I'll make sure to bring that up when I see him tomorrow. I'm sure he's still
right,
thrilled about that.
For sure. Well, let's zoom out here a little bit, as we wrap up. Let's, for the long history of Horus, it's been this side project that you've run as a business, / labor of love, while maintaining your primary employment as an accountant. What is this? What's the long-term picture for Horus? What is your goal with this? And, what is the, what do you hope to achieve with it?
Yeah. I would love to turn the glorified hobby into my full-time professional gig, all up. I'll be honest with you. I've achieved a lot of things already that I had only really dreamed about. Having my beer in Disneyland and working with like Run the Jewels and some of my favorite musicians and doing all this crazy stuff, winning medals and all that. It's just been like a bonus. So I think being able to make a living and do what I love full time would be the end goal. My daughter's 5.5 years old now. My son's 1.5. So I'm probably a year and a half away from being able to see what that really looks like ultimately.
Yeah.
the little side brand, Ferris Falcon, brewing the IPAs and possibly opening up a tasting room with that, I think will be a big part, as well as I started making mead professionally about 6 months ago. I'm very excited about, and I think that can grow quite a bit too. The first mead I submitted to Major Cup actually won gold. So
nice.
Next year, submitting 10 meads and seeing how things take off on those two. Like I said earlier, I made more mead than beer at home. I'm really excited about that next chapter too. So just continuing doing what I'm doing, but make it, slightly bigger, not much bigger. I don't think I can handle much more. But being able, I think a huge thing for me would be a tasting room. That's where, you can make pretty good money on lager and IPA in pints, over your counter. I've been told that from a brewer I've ever met. And it just blows their mind that I sell 99% of my beer, packaged in bottles. They think I'm crazy, but that's how I had to do it from the beginning, and that's what I'm comfortable with right now. So to answer your question, probably a little bit of the same for these next few years, and then kind of look at things and see how I can make this my career from here on out only.
Well, you are a little bit crazy, but I think that's what keeps it interesting and makes the beer good. G&D's microchannel condensers use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers. Raw malt has been a benchmark of quality and consistency since 1847. Reclaim your margins with quality craft concentrates from Old Orchard. Get detailed insight into your fermentations with Brew Monitor, risk-free. Put SS Brewtech's tech advances to work in your brew house, and PBW tablets from 5 Star Chemicals are a quick way to optimize your cleaning. Of course, if you enjoy this podcast every week, we would love your support. Just go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. Many of the guests we talk to here share additional insights, recipes, and more in the pages of Craft Beer and Brewing magazine and our pro-focused Brewing Industry Guide magazine. Our all-access subscriptions give you access to that, along with video classes from some of the best in the biz. Kyle, thanks for talking to me about how you brew these crazy, interesting, adjunct-forward, barrel-aged, beers. You're making some beautiful beers in the process, and it's amazing to me that you're all still doing this, not as a full-time job, and still holding down a family and a separate full-time job on top of it. That's insane. That's patently insane. I don't know when you sleep.
I get a good amount. My wife's an entrepreneur too, and she's kind of figured out that lifestyle balance that really helps. So she does a lot with the kids, a lot more than I do, that's for sure. So yeah, man, thank you for having me. I know we've been talking about this for probably a couple of years now, so I'm glad it finally worked out.
It's been a little time coming, but I thought the time was ripe. I've kept meaning to get down to Southern California so we can do this in person, and then just timing has never worked out. So let's just do it. If people want to learn more about Horus Aged Ales, where do they find you?
Everything is pretty much Instagram, so at Horus Aged Ales, all one word. My website I haven't really touched for like 4 years. I
noticed Twitter, that. Some hot new blog posts from 2017.
Yeah, if that becomes my full-time thing someday, then maybe I can get that website updated finally. But
for sure. So catch Horus on the gram right now. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me for the podcast. I hope everybody out there gets their boosters, stays safe, wears their masks, takes care of folks. Let's keep breweries open. Let's keep the economy rolling. Let's keep the good times coming, despite this Omicron variant that seems to be getting in the way of our good times this year. Be safe, take care of each other. Kyle, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Jamie. Have a good one, man.
Yeah, cheers.
All right, bye.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.